Happening now, a major escalation in President Trump's trade war with Mexico and Canada.
While headlines focused on tariff battles and political drama, Canada quietly executed one of the most brilliant economic deals in modern history. When trade wars erupted, everyone expected Canada to buckle under pressure and accept whatever terms America demanded. Instead, Canada did something unprecedented. They built bridges to Asia, Europe, and beyond, while America built walls. That is how Canada's GDP growth hit 2.6%. Foreign investment surged, and global corporations started moving operations north. But what's this secret deal that turned Canada from an economic dependent into a global leader? What does this mean for your future? And what happens when other middle powers start copying the Canadian playbook? Watch till the end, because the answers will change everything. The tariff tsunami, your morning coffee, your car payment, your job security, everything just became more expensive overnight. What started as targeted trade measures in March 2025 quickly evolved into something far more comprehensive and devastating than anyone had anticipated. The initial 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum and steel seemed manageable, almost routine in the context of previous trade disputes. Then came the doubling, 50%. The number hit the North American economy like a freight train. Unlike Trump's first-term approach, which focused on specific sectors like steel or automobiles, this campaign was comprehensive, affecting virtually every Canadian export. Lumber, energy, manufactured goods, agricultural products, nothing was spared. The message from Washington was crystal clear. The old rules no longer applied. CNN's economic analysts struggled to calculate the consumer impact. This major increase would inevitably be passed on to consumers, raising prices for everything from cars to canned goods. American families would see their grocery bills climb as Canadian agricultural imports became prohibitively expensive. The automotive sector, deeply integrated across the border, faced particular devastation as components that crossed multiple times during production would be hit with tariffs at each crossing. Canadian energy exports, a critical sector representing billions in annual revenue, faced a 10% levy that would ripple through heating bills and gasoline prices across the American Northeast. The irony wasn't lost on industry observers. Americans would pay more for the very Canadian energy they depended on to keep their lights on and homes warm. The comprehensiveness of the tariff regime revealed something more sinister than simple protectionism. This was economic warfare, designed not just to protect American industries, but to fundamentally restructure North American trade relationships. Canadian exports, which had flowed freely across the border under decades of trade agreements, suddenly faced barriers that made many transactions economically impossible. Breaking point business. How does a company survive when its biggest customer becomes its biggest threat? Across Canada, business leaders faced an impossible calculus as they watched their largest market transform into their greatest liability. The stories emerging from corporate Canada weren't just about numbers and spreadsheets. They were about survival, adaptation, and the human cost of economic warfare. Label Pack Printing had built its business around American customers, developing relationships that spanned decades. The Toronto-based company had grown from a small family operation into a regional powerhouse by serving the packaging needs of American manufacturers. If Trump throws a 50% tariff on our goods, it will wipe us out overnight, the company's leadership stated bluntly, echoing a sentiment felt across Canadian industry. In British Columbia, a pharmaceutical firm that had spent years cultivating American distribution networks made a dramatic pivot. Rather than wait for the tariff axe to fall, they began negotiating deals with Asian partners, bypassing United States buyers entirely. The shift wasn't just strategic, it was emotional. Generations of Canadian businesses had viewed America as their natural market, their economic family. A Montreal-based steel component supplier took a more direct approach, warning American clients that prices were about to double. They weren't bluffing. The integrated supply chains that had made North American manufacturing competitive globally were becoming liability chains, transferring American tariff costs directly to American consumers. The irony was stark. Protectionist policies designed to help American businesses were making those same businesses less competitive. The human stories behind these corporate decisions revealed the true cost of the trade war. Employees who had built careers serving American markets faced uncertain futures. Small communities that had prospered from cross-border trade watched their economic foundations crumble. The predictability doctrine. What Trade Minister Mary revealed wasn't just policy, it was economic warfare disguised as strategy. Her declaration that Canada was creating predictability not as a slogan but as a strategy represented far more than defensive posturing. It was the articulation of a new economic doctrine that would reshape the entire North American economic relationship. The genius of Mary Ng's approach lay in its simplicity. While Washington lurched from one trade threat to another, Ottawa was systematically building alternatives. The government wasn't just reacting to American tariffs. They were proactively constructing an economic infrastructure that could function independently of American goodwill. The coordination between government and private sector was unprecedented. Rather than leaving businesses to navigate trade uncertainty alone, Canadian officials were actively facilitating new partnerships, providing intelligence on emerging markets, and creating incentives for diversification. The message was clear. Canada was committed to reducing its dependence on the American market. This wasn't just about trade policy, it was about national economic security. The vulnerability exposed by American tariff threats had revealed the danger of overdependence on any single market, no matter how large or historically reliable. The predictability doctrine represented a conscious decision to prioritize economic sovereignty over the convenience of proximity. By positioning predictability as a competitive advantage, Canada was essentially marketing itself to global investors as the stable alternative to American volatility. Foreign businesses looking for reliable partners would increasingly view Canadian stability as worth premium pricing, creating a new form of economic competitive advantage. The Great Diversification. The middle class wasn't just watching their jobs disappear, they were witnessing their entire economic foundation crumble. The $2.3 billion Indo-Pacific strategy that Canadian officials unveiled represented more than a trade initiative. It was a declaration of economic independence that would reshape global commerce patterns, targeting 40 countries and 4 billion people. This wasn't defensive maneuvering, it was offensive economic strategy designed to replace American markets entirely. Indonesia emerged as the crown jewel of this new approach. With a population exceeding 280 million people and G20 economy status, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership eliminated over 90% of tariffs on Indonesian goods entering Canada. The deal wasn't just about trade volumes, it was about strategic positioning. While America retreated from global trade alliances, Canada was doubling down on international partnerships. The critical minerals component revealed the long-term thinking behind Canadian strategy. Investments in Indonesian nickel and bauxite weren't just about immediate trade benefits. They were about securing supply chains for the battery production that would define the next generation of automotive and technology industries. Indonesia hailed Canada as a trusted partner, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that American partners were experiencing. Canadian workers in traditional manufacturing sectors watched these developments with mixed emotions. The diversification promised long-term security, but required immediate adaptation. Factories that had spent decades perfecting processes for American markets now needed to understand Indonesian specifications, Asian quality standards, and Pacific shipping logistics. The learning curve was steep, but the alternative was potential obsolescence. The geographic scope of the Indo-Pacific strategy reflected sophisticated economic planning. Rather than simply replacing one dominant partner with another, Canada was creating a distributed network of relationships that would make future economic coercion virtually impossible. No single country could hold Canadian prosperity hostage the way America had been able to do. Look, we just broke down Canada's entire economic pivot strategy, the $2.3 billion plan, the 40-country network, the Indonesia partnership details that took months to uncover. You now have the complete playbook that most analysts are still trying to figure out. If this kind of deep research saves you time, hit that subscribe button. Investment flight. In just 12 months, foreign investors discovered something that would reshape North American economics forever. The investment flows that had reliably moved south across the Canadian border were not just slowing, they were reversing. Foreign direct investment in Canada surged to over 50 billion United States dollars, representing a 9% year-over-year increase that caught even the most optimistic economists off guard. The contrast with American investment trends was stark. While Canada attracted record foreign investment, United States foreign direct investment plummeted by 28%. The mathematical impossibility of coincidence became clear. Capital wasn't just avoiding America, it was actively seeking Canadian alternatives. alternatives. International investors were voting with their dollars, and the results were reshaping continental economic geography. The investment patterns revealed sophisticated risk assessment by global financial institutions. The political stability premium that Canada offered wasn't just theoretical. It was quantifiable in investment decisions worth billions. Multinational corporations were calculating the cost of American policy unpredictability against the benefits of Canadian regulatory consistency, and Canada was winning. Portfolio diversification strategies that had traditionally favored American markets were being fundamentally reconsidered. Investment advisors who had spent careers recommending American assets as safe havens were explaining to clients why Canadian stability might offer better risk-adjusted returns. The implications extended beyond immediate investment flows to long-term capital allocation patterns. The 2023 statistics represented more than annual variation. They indicated a structural shift in how global capital viewed North American opportunities. Canadian markets were attracting not just overflow from American uncertainty, but primary investment interest based on their own merits. The economic divorce was creating investment opportunities that hadn't existed when the relationship was stable. The corporate calculation: when does a global corporation abandon the world's largest economy? When staying becomes more expensive than leaving. Foxconn's announcement to investors that they had already diversified beyond the United States market represented more than corporate strategy. It was a seismic shift in how multinational companies viewed American market access versus global stability. The Taiwanese electronics giant's decision wasn't made in isolation. Semiconductor firms were actively scouting Canadian university campuses for future research lab locations, drawn by government incentives, skilled workforce availability, and most importantly, policy predictability. The brain drain that America had historically created by attracting global talent was beginning to reverse as uncertainty made long-term planning impossible. Asian and European companies were announcing multi-billion-dollar battery and critical mineral investments in Canada with increasing frequency. These weren't defensive moves to avoid American tariffs. They were strategic decisions to position themselves in markets that offered stability and growth potential. Canada was becoming a preferred destination for industries that required massive capital investments and decade-long development timelines. The corporate relocations carried cultural significance beyond their economic impact. Companies that had built their global strategies around American market access were fundamentally reconsidering their geographic priorities. Proximity to American consumers was being weighed against the costs of American policy volatility, and proximity was losing. The social movement implications were profound. Corporate loyalty, traditionally based on market size and historical relationships, was shifting towards stability and predictability. Companies were essentially voting with their facilities, choosing Canadian locations over American alternatives despite potentially smaller immediate market access. The Honda dilemma. This wasn't just about cars anymore. It was about the future of North American manufacturing. Honda's $15 billion electric vehicle project in Ontario had become a symbol of everything at stake in the trade war. The Japanese automaker's internal deliberations reflected the impossible choices facing multinational corporations, caught between American market access and policy predictability. The project represented more than manufacturing capacity. It embodied the transition to electric vehicles that would define the automotive industry's future. Honda's decision to proceed or relocate would signal to other manufacturers whether Canada could be trusted as a platform for next-generation automotive development, or whether American political pressure would force production back south of the border. The cross-sector implications extended far beyond automotive manufacturing. If Honda relocated the project to avoid potential American tariffs, it would validate the effectiveness of economic coercion as a policy tool. Other industries would face similar pressures, potentially unraveling decades of continental economic integration. The stakes couldn't be higher. Historical parallels to previous industrial relocations provided sobering context. When manufacturers had previously abandoned regions due to political instability or economic uncertainty, the effects had proven nearly impossible to reverse. Communities that lost major industrial anchors rarely recovered their previous prosperity levels, and the skilled workforce typically migrated to follow the opportunities. Corporate strategic planning horizons revealed the fundamental challenge. Automotive investments required decade-long commitments with massive upfront capital requirements. Companies needed policy predictability to justify these investments, and American trade policy was providing exactly the opposite signal. Michigan's miscalculation: your paycheck wasn't just at risk, it was collateral damage in a trade war you never asked for. In Michigan, where 1 in 5 jobs was tied to the automotive sector, the tariff war wasn't an abstract policy debate. It was an existential threat to entire communities built around cross-border manufacturing. The state that had defined American automotive excellence was discovering that protectionism could destroy the very industries it claimed to protect. Detroit area supplier networks faced a cascade of disruptions that threatened decades of carefully constructed relationships. Small manufacturers who had spent generations perfecting components for Canadian assembly plants watched their contracts evaporate overnight. The integrated supply chains that had made American automotive manufacturing globally competitive were becoming liability chains, transferring tariff costs directly to American consumers and workers. The human cost extended far beyond factory closures and layoffs. Automotive communities in Michigan had built their identities around cross-border collaboration, with families on both sides of the Detroit River sharing economic destinies. The trade war was severing these connections, forcing communities to choose between national loyalty and economic survival. Working-class families bore the immediate burden of protectionist policies. Vehicle prices that had been rising gradually were now spiking dramatically as tariffs added thousands of dollars to the cost of Canadian manufactured cars and components. The same workers that protectionist rhetoric claimed to protect were finding their purchasing power diminished by the policies implemented in their name. The vulnerability of blue-collar America to trade disruption revealed the fundamental contradiction in protectionist logic. Industries that depended on efficient supply chains and competitive pricing couldn't be protected by measures that increased costs and reduced efficiency. The Ferrari factor? What happened next would prove that trade wars don't just hurt the poor, they tax the wealthy too. Ferrari's preemptive 10% price increase in the American market served as a stark reminder that tariff impacts respect no economic boundaries. Even luxury consumers, historically insulated from trade policy effects, found themselves paying premium prices for premium products in an increasingly expensive marketplace. The luxury vehicle market's vulnerability to tariff disruption revealed sophisticated economic interconnections that policymakers had underestimated. High-end automotive manufacturers relied on global supply chains for specialized components that couldn't be easily replaced with domestic alternatives. When tariffs increased costs for these irreplaceable inputs, manufacturers had no choice but to pass the increases directly to consumers. Market elasticity analysis showed troubling patterns for American luxury consumers. Unlike mass-market vehicles where consumers might delay purchases or choose alternatives, luxury buyers had fewer substitution options. This created a captive market for tariff-induced price increases, making wealthy Americans unwilling tax collectors for protectionist policies they hadn't requested. The premium automotive sector's response demonstrated how global markets adapted to trade barriers. Rather than absorbing tariff costs through reduced profit margins, manufacturers maintained their pricing power by explicitly attributing price increases to American trade policy. Luxury consumers were paying more and knowing exactly why, a politically dangerous combination for policymakers. Consumer behavior modification at premium price levels provided economic indicators that extended far beyond automotive purchases. When wealthy Americans reduced discretionary spending due to tariff-induced price increases, the effects rippled through luxury retail, high-end services, and investment markets. Supply chain strangulation. How does an industry survive when its bloodstream, the supply chain, starts clotting? The interconnected North American manufacturing system that had evolved over 6 decades was being systematically destroyed by policies that failed to understand how modern industry actually functioned. Components that had crossed the border multiple times during production were now subject to tariff multiplication that made final products prohibitively expensive. The automotive sector provided the clearest example of supply chain vulnerability. A single vehicle might contain components that crossed the Canadian-American border 5 or 6 times during various stages of manufacturing and assembly. Each border crossing triggered tariff assessments, creating exponential cost increases that made the final product uncompetitive in global markets. Manufacturing efficiency that had been optimized over generations was being sacrificed for political symbolism. Companies that had spent decades perfecting just-in-time delivery systems and lean manufacturing processes were forced to redesign their entire operational models to accommodate tariff uncertainties. The efficiency gains that had made North American manufacturing globally competitive were being systematically eliminated. Corporate strategy discussions increasingly focused on supply chain resilience rather than efficiency optimization. Companies were choosing domestic suppliers not because they offered better products or prices, but because they eliminated border crossing risks. This defensive approach to supply chain management increased costs while reducing innovation and competitive advantage. Long-term implications extended far beyond immediate tariff impacts. Once supply chains were redesigned to avoid border crossings, the efficiency gains from reintegration would require years to recover, even if trade policies returned to previous norms. The Bourbon and Orange backlash. The retaliation wasn't just economic, it was surgical, targeting the heart of American agricultural identity. Canadian counter-tariffs struck with precision that revealed sophisticated understanding of American political geography. Florida oranges and Kentucky bourbon weren't chosen randomly. They represented cultural symbols of American agriculture that carried political weight far beyond their economic value. The agricultural sector's vulnerability to trade retaliation exposed the political calculations behind protectionist policies. Rural American communities that had historically supported aggressive trade measures discovered that their own products made attractive targets for foreign retaliation. The same political rhetoric that had promised to protect American industries was making American farmers collateral damage in trade conflicts. Historical parallels to previous trade wars provided sobering context for agricultural communities. Farmers had traditionally borne disproportionate costs during trade conflicts because agricultural products made effective retaliatory targets. International buyers could source commodities from multiple suppliers, making American producers easily replaceable in global markets. The precision of Canadian targeting revealed sophisticated trade war strategy. Rather than imposing broad retaliatory measures that might harm Canadian consumers, Ottawa selected specific American products that would create maximum political pressure while minimizing domestic costs. This surgical approach maximized the political impact of retaliation while demonstrating Canadian strategic sophistication. Rural economic communities faced impossible choices between political loyalty and economic survival. Bourbon distillers in Kentucky and orange growers in Florida found their livelihoods threatened by policies they might have previously supported. The abstract benefits of protectionism were being weighed against concrete losses in agricultural income and market access. The Berlin-Jakarta axis. The offices opening weren't in Buffalo or Chicago. They were in Berlin, Jakarta, and Dubai, reshaping global commerce forever. Canadian companies that had spent generations building relationships across the longest undefended border were now establishing operations thousands of miles away, creating new economic corridors that bypassed America entirely. This geographic diversification represented more than business strategy. It was economic evolution in real time. The European Union relationship deepened beyond traditional trade partnerships into comprehensive economic integration. Canadian businesses discovered that European consumers valued stability and predictability as much as competitive pricing, creating market opportunities that transcended simple cost calculations. The rules-based economy that Canada offered appealed to European partners who had grown weary of American policy volatility. Japanese partnerships flourished as both nations recognized their shared commitment to multilateral trade relationships and technological innovation. The cultural affinity between Canadian and Japanese business practices created synergies that American partnerships had never achieved. Despite geographic proximity, Australian relationships expanded beyond resource extraction into sophisticated manufacturing and technology collaboration. Indian economic engagement accelerated as both nations recognized the potential for massive market development. With India's growing middle class and Canada's technological expertise, expertise. The partnership offered long-term growth potential that dwarfed traditional North American markets. These weren't defensive relationships formed to avoid American tariffs. They were offensive strategies designed to capture emerging market opportunities. The relationship portfolio that Canada was building prioritized diversification over convenience. Rather than depending on any single large partner, Canadian strategy emphasized multiple medium-sized relationships that collectively provided greater security than previous American dependence. The trust premium? What's the dollar value of predictability? The answer was reshaping international investment flows in ways that traditional economic models had never anticipated. Multinational chief executive officers weren't just preferring Canadian stability over American volatility. They were paying premium prices for the privilege of doing business in predictable environments. Political risk assessments that had traditionally favored American investments were being fundamentally reconsidered. International insurance companies were adjusting their risk models to account for American policy unpredictability, making Canadian investments more attractive from pure financial perspectives. The trust premium wasn't theoretical. It was quantifiable in insurance rates, contract terms, and investment returns. Investment fund managers discovered that Canadian assets offered stability premiums that their clients increasingly valued over pure return maximization. Portfolio diversification strategies that had emphasized American market access were shifting toward Canadian market stability. The psychological comfort of predictable governance was translating into measurable financial advantages. Corporate location decisions increasingly factored long-term political stability into their calculations. Manufacturing investments that required decade-long amortization periods needed assurance that policy frameworks would remain consistent throughout the investment lifecycle. Canadian provincial governments were offering exactly that assurance, while American jurisdictions struggled with federal policy uncertainty. The competitive advantage of predictable governance extended beyond immediate business operations into talent attraction and retention. International professionals were choosing Canadian career opportunities over American alternatives, specifically because of political stability considerations. The GDP growth paradox. The economy wasn't just surviving the divorce, it was thriving, proving that sometimes breaking up is the best decision. Canadian gross domestic product growth reached 2.6% annualized in late 2024, exceeding all expert predictions and confounding economists who had forecast recession due to trade disruption. The resilience surprised even Canadian policymakers who had hoped for survival rather than success. Economic indicators across multiple sectors showed consistent strength despite ongoing trade tensions. Employment remained stable, consumer confidence improved, and business investment continued growing. The feared economic collapse from American trade retaliation never materialized. National economic confidence reached levels not seen since the commodity boom years. Innovation metrics showed unexpected improvements as Canadian companies were forced to develop solutions for new markets and partners. The creative destruction of established trade patterns was spurring technological advancement and process innovation that enhanced long-term competitiveness. The 51st state joke. The spokesperson's offhand remark about Canada becoming America's 51st state drew no laughs because everyone knew who was really winning. The joke that was supposed to demonstrate American dominance instead highlighted the growing disparity between Canadian success and American isolation. Global observers weren't laughing at Canadian independence. They were investing in it. The comment revealed fundamental misunderstanding of power dynamics in modern economic relationships. While American policymakers clung to outdated models of geographic proximity determining economic relationships, Canada was proving that trust and stability could overcome distance in globalized markets. Historical parallels to other economic relationships that had dissolved and reformed showed that proximity didn't guarantee prosperity. Countries that had successfully diversified away from dominant partners had consistently achieved greater long-term stability and growth than those that remained dependent. Canada was following a proven path to economic independence. The strategic lessons emerging from Canada's economic transformation were being studied by other middle power nations seeking to reduce their dependence on larger neighbors. The Canadian model of diversification through multilateral relationships was becoming a template for economic independence that transcended North American relevance. The world was watching as Canada proved that in a globalized economy, building bridges beats building walls, and the neighbors who once took each other for granted would never be the same again. The economic divorce that had seemed like a crisis was becoming the foundation for unprecedented prosperity and independence. The 51st state joke had backfired spectacularly, revealing that the real question wasn't whether Canada could survive without America, but whether America could compete with a truly independent Canada. Now, is Canada's economic independence strategy something other countries should copy? Will this economic divorce reshape global trade patterns permanently? What do you think? Let's talk in the comments.